Okay, so here we are, Chapter 4, the General Intellect Unit, Brain of the Firm, Reading Group. We are talking about Chapter 4, the Organization of Unthinkable Systems. And Beer in the intro describes this as follows. So, of course, we all know that things cannot be organized down to the last iota, and that indeed an awful lot of things just organize themselves. But when we know exactly why, we can approach the problem of how. This is the subject of Chapter 4, the nature of self-organization in very large systems. By understanding these principles properly, we may well be able to facilitate regulation without imposing it. And that is something all good managers try to do. There are some more new words here, which experience again shows to be useful to managers, with an account of a deceptively simple little machine I call an Algona Node. I have explained why in the text. But why another new word? The answer is that no one has actually isolated this mechanism before, and therefore it has no name. We all know about it, but the intention of cybernetics is to try to make such vaguely understood tricks perfectly explicit and clear, so that we really know how to use them. In Chapter 5, that's Chapter 5. So, we have self-organization, we have the Algona Node. There's a couple other things covered in this chapter, but what are some general thoughts about the organization of unthinkable systems?
I did love the line. Oh, go ahead.
Jay, you had your hand up?
Yeah. I don't know how explicit it was in the text, but one of the things I got from it was that, well, actually, it was quite explicit in the exponentials and how many states and input states these things blow up into. Or maybe that was last week and I'm mixing up with that. But so I believe one of the ways that he says, more or less, that you can deal with this kind of stuff is to abstract and to treat a lot of these kind of states as the same sort of class of states. And so abstraction can serve to reduce variety in that kind of way, I believe. So that's one of the things I took away from it.
I also quite liked towards the end talking about the almost translations of meta languages as a bridge between layers of the system. I thought that was really useful, and it's clear this is what leads into the next chapter for sure, and it's going to lead directly into the EVSM.
Right. Absolutely. And Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, the meta language part was the part that really jumped out at me, partially because it reflects something I think a lot about of the connection between this sort of stuff and really philosophy of science, and that how uncertainty means that incompleteness, and I guess also uncertainty to another degree, makes it so that there really is just an upper limit of how good a model you can ever have. And so, instead of trying to perfectly model everything and have a try to have a map that really is the size of the territory. Really, it's about rules of communication between you and your environment and how to achieve your goals. I also like that in general, he poses communication as hard. As systems are very different internally, and having any kind of coordination, any kind of symbol that really gets information across, that's a difficult task. Yeah,
absolutely. And I especially was interested with this kind of meta language discussion in this chapter because it reminded me a lot of the way that Racket is structured as a programming language. So that I was like, oh, this is sort of language-based programming is kind of coherent with what Beer is saying here. Rudy, do you have another thing to add to this? All right, so let's dive in then. Let's start at the beginning.
Go
ahead.
This there's a book that was actually posted in on the channel about from Maspeo and Reyes, which was talking about effective communication, and he was talking about it deviating from the Shannon idea of information theory, which was just simply about communicating over noisy channels, and moved into effective like communication means that you're expecting a response. So it's a dialogue, not just like sending a message one way. And that really, I do think, is about like bridging those meta languages.
Right. That certainly adds like a layer of complexity to that transmission model, because the transmission model kind of assumes that you're operating in the same language, as far as I understand. Whereas, you can have translation problems. Matt, go ahead.
The fact that hum a few bars and I'll fake it is like a thing for human intelligences it's really quite incredible, because like that is the kind of thing that like we're starting to sort of be able to teach some machine learning algorithms, but like the idea of like having this not only a set of shared symbols, but be able to just sort of interact with something and sort of figure out on some symbols like to settle on is like that's a huge thing. Also, when you mention Racket, a lot of this stuff really echoes to me Douglas Hofstadter and Gerdel Escher-Bach, and he loves Lisp. Like for really, I don't really know much about like Racket specifically, but I mean like I imagine it's the same. It's on the same angle.
It's along the same lines. It just has kind of explicit support for defining languages and using a language to solve a problem. So it's a little, it's an addition on top of normal Lisp, but it's working in the same paradigm. Absolutely. Don't know too much about it myself. Just started using it, so I can't speak definitively to that. But it's a good approach. And Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, the philosophy of language-oriented programming is if you have a problem or a series of problems are all sort of clustered together, then you design a language that addresses that problem. And so, like in object-oriented programming, you figure out what the objects are, you create those objects, and the program is built around those objects. In typed programming, you figure out what the data types are. In language-oriented programming, you figure out what language describes the problem, and you build that language. And Racket is set up that way. It's like the whole macro system in Racket is designed that you use Racket to write the language that solves the problem, and then you work on the problem in that language.
By language-oriented design, you're almost, is that another word for domain-driven design? Sort of the idea from, Bill Evans? Because I've heard, because his conception is it's very much like Java object-oriented type of text, but he says the ultimate goal of a computer system almost is a DSL, domain-specific language. So you are supposed to eventually coalesce into something like that. If you keep evolving, refining the language model that you're using.
Yeah, I mean, you use Racket to build a DSL around the domain of your problem. I mean, you can use it in all kinds of ways. It's a Turing-complete language. You can do what you want with it. But it was designed that you use Racket to design a language around the issues you're dealing with.
Yeah, so that's... definitely interesting given the contents of this chapter. But we'll go ahead and dive into it then. So we start out with the discussion of complexity in nature, and we get the sort of the map and the country example. The best computer of natural systems is the natural system itself. Think of the sea. It is calm. The tide turns and a great wind arises. The water is grossly disturbed. Can we imagine having to program a computer with the relevant inputs of the situation in order to discover the precise output in terms of ruffled water? The task is hopeless, yet the sea works continuously, inexorably. It produces the answer. The answer is the waves and the current, the vortices, the flying spray. So this is in prose expressing what Beer's poem that is included in the Cybernetic Brain also describes, right? It's the same idea. If anyone remembers that, we covered it on GIU, just talking about the waves as these kind of collapsing systems, but the water perfectly computing its own output continuously. And that is something that is peculiar to nature. So were there any thoughts about this nature as the perfect simulation of itself idea? The nature is the answer to itself? Rudy, go ahead.
I think this is where I finally get to Jeremy's point that there's a lot of Aristotelianism in beer, because he's always saying, like, the point of this is what it does, the point of this is what it does, the point of this is what it does. And this is also a value statement in some way. I don't really disagree with it, but this statement is not as obvious as it seems.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, he's basically saying the point of the Earth is to be the Earth and survive. And it's assuming some sort of teleology, sense of purpose, where there just might simply be no sense of purpose. The Earth just is, rather than it solving its own equations. And then, of course, then you can say, there's God's plan or whatever. But even without going into that, you're just making the first step in assuming that everything has a purpose. Yeah. And that is already an assumption that is not necessarily obvious.
Yes. I think I guess it's a kind of intuition that I can certainly see arising from the practical orientation of a systems analyst or a kind of like managing consultant, analyzing all these systems and trying to come up with models of them and interacting with reality in that way. I can see the appeal of that kind of toletic model. Third Creed, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think later on in the chapter, he does kind of have the ultimate motivation of any system be to survive. And that's almost like pragmatism, I have a very naive understanding of all these things, but it seems like it just appears to reflect that model, that sort of Aristotelian teleologic model. Now, later on in the chapter, he kind of gets to where he says, hey, why are we doing any of this thing? Well, it's not so much what can we say about what it's doing. Is there anything we can say about it? Only one thing we can really say, and that's that it's trying to survive, which almost is like anti that. It's sort of just pure pragmatism, and almost like Rorty or something.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I can see some analogies to Dewey in what's being described here too, in terms of the pragmatism. I guess, yeah, I do get the sense, though, like in Beer's poetry, that there is something beyond simply a recognition of pragmatic self-reproduction in his thought. Like when he talks about sort of like the perfection of the water as being like, beyond calculation, but calculating itself perfectly. There is something that does seem to be like a kind of, philosophical appreciation for the self-arising of nature. that's maybe not entirely just pragmatic. Obviously, pragmatism can describe a variety of philosophical positions. So I just mean that in the most pejorative sense of like, well, it's just purely pragmatic. Okay, well that's pretty interesting, and I am interested to see like, the other elements of Aristotelianism that come out in beer, or the other elements of pragmatism that come out in beer, because I know that like what is it? Eudaimonia is a big concept for him as well, so it's got that kind of Aristotelian bent. But we'll keep talking about that as we go on. So there's this discussion about the biosphere, about how it manages to organize itself, given that, like one little element of it, these aphids could produce, 822 million tons of aphids in a single season. But somehow the biosphere does not just become like a paperclip factory that only produces paperclips. So the ecological system is self-organizing. It is itself the vast computer that gets the answers right, or roughly so, give or take a few plagues, famines, and so forth. But it has no program, no planning department, no licenses to breed, no bureaucracy. It just works. We, the intelligent humans, interfere with the system, unbalancing it for our own ends. Thus we increase crop and livestock yields, but we treat the lower orders of life as if we were gods outside the ecological system, forgetting that we ourselves are very much part and parcel of the whole. The result is that we can fairly effectively control the proliferation of Pastorella pestis, the bacillus, which gives rise to bubonic plague, but not the proliferation of our own species, Homo sapiens. We can see that our cows are fed, but not our own brothers over half the world. So here, I mean, there's a few things that are interesting. Like, Beer suggesting that, like, a plague is nature, like, is an error in nature. It doesn't get the answers right. Is an interesting suggestion. Like, I don't know why you would isolate that as, like, I guess this, okay, so I think this kind of gets into, like, the discussion of error at the end of the chapter, right? Like, if you read this at first glance, I was like, wait, is he saying that, like, in a sort of a truly perfect natural system, there would be no plagues? This is like something wrong. But when he gets to talking about error at the end of the chapter and how error can be useful or functional or it should be in the system, then I think it's kind of like we can appreciate that he sees a meaningful role for these, like, big swings in the system to adjust things. So what do people think about this here section? Okay, we'll go to Third Creed.
This may be part of a similar sort of misunderstanding I have about it, but yeah, I read this as like not an error in its purpose, but an error in its stability. It's like it's an oscillation. It's like there's a big swing that's a famine, a big swing that's a plague, but like, but then he's like remarking on how it self-organizes as a system, and it's like, oh, it looks like it's stopped. That's how I'm interpreting it, though.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to view it as an oscillation and to view it from a perspective of homeostasis. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, just to agree with that, really. I saw like a couple of references to error and inaccuracy in this chapter, and to me, they kind of seem to be kind of different kinds of error. So you have error, which is like an inaccurate value being read. You have error, which is like a destabilization to the system. And you have error that is just like just not being hyper-focused and kind of just exploring without knowing whether or not you're going to be getting anywhere good, and just like it's like more like variation, really. So I guess this is more just destabilization rather than exploration or, like re-establishing balance or anything like that. Unless someone here has like a deeper knowledge of things like plagues, where like they play a role in the ecological sphere. I don't know.
I mean, I'm not an ecologist, but it does seem to be like it would be perhaps like overly idealistic to view a ecology that does not have oscillations as the ideal, or to view like plagues as like purely functional towards some kind of like ecological ideal state. I think there's probably something quite subtle going on here in terms of oscillations and system stability that we should continue to think about. Matt, go on.
Yeah, also it's like on a practical level, like I mean, it's weird to see like this be like described, like connected to other things, because I mean this is also just literally what you have to do with like machine learning algorithms. What's it's for there's a thing vanishing gradients that basically, and it's a problem with some kinds of models like more than others, but like if it learns the thing too well, and not only learns it too well, now it actually can't learn anymore. And there's all this stuff you have to do, including ways of introducing either people call it either error or bias, and I don't think either of those are very good words for it. But yeah, I mean like a little bit of random just to nudge it out of like because it might just be in I think another relevant term is it can go from having like a lot of potential variety to really just oscillating between like two states or whatever, and now it actually can't go into any others. And so like you just need a little bit of randomness, a little bit of noise to just make sure that it's not just like perfectly sliding in between like this equilibrium.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Nico, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. For the pulses and this kind of like non-equilibrium state, it's a huge concept of systems ecology insofar as this is how systems maximize, I guess, their power. It's kind of a teleology of sorts for ecology itself. The idea that these systems' purpose is to, again, maximize power in the most obvious sense. But the coupling of like predator and prey models is like where this like first idea came off from, like you have the prey shifts, the predator shifts, etc., etc. And then as for like diseases, they play crucial roles for this density-dependent response. So far as if you have a kind of one species taking over, it will prevent it from actually destabilize the entire system itself. So there are positive roles for it, but I mean, yeah.
Right. Well, I guess we do sort of have to read these comments as being oriented towards this idea of survival, or we could say power maximization if we wanted to phrase it in a different terms. Okay. So that's section there, and we get this talk about an anastomotic reticulum. That we cannot properly understand or do not properly understand. They are not, we can be sure, optimal ways in a mathematical sense. There is not the computing capacity. It can hardly be too often repeated to evaluate all possible outcomes and choose the best on some criterion of efficiency. There is instead a mechanism which selects particular modes of organization that are survival worthy. So, I was just talking with Tom and Shane on General Intellect. We were doing an episode on an article about planning, and this seems really relevant to that because if we look at nature from this perspective of sort of like unknowable systems, then we should certainly think about economic plans in a similar way, because these are like anastomotic reticula that we can't fully model, and we shouldn't be approaching it from the perspective of absolute optimization, but rather what he says here, evaluate all possible a mechanism which selects particular modes of organization that are survival worthy. So, the selection body here would presumably be in planning, like some kind of democratic decision-making process, and it would just have to be presented with reasonable options to be chosen amongst. That's my thoughts on this section. Any other thoughts here? Jay, go ahead.
There's a couple of notions from AI that might be relevant here. One of them is obviously perfect rationality, which even most optimistic AI practitioners would agree on isn't reasonable, right? Maybe at all. Then there's this other notion of calculated rationality, where you start the calculation at a particular time, and you might eventually get to an optimal outcome, but by the time you do, the moment's passed, right? And so that matters in dynamic environments which are always changing. It might matter less in on a chessboard where calculated rationality is perfectly fine. You can keep on going until you get the answer you want. And then, of course, you have the notions of bounded rationality, which I think is from Herbert Simon, where you just kind of use the resources you have to get a good enough solution that you need. But then, of course, that pushes the thing down the road onto what is a good enough solution. But then maybe this kind of performative operation will come into effect there, where you're kind of going backwards and forwards with these feedbacks, and you're trying to figure out what that good enough solution is as you go, rather than trying to decide up ahead. Because another idea in AI is that problem formation has to follow goal formation. And one of the things Beer is saying here is that sometimes you can't even formulate your goal. And so much of AI writing assumes that this goal is easy to formulate, and then the problem is formulated after that. So yeah, I think a lot of these ideas are pretty important to that, actually. Especially this one about you might not even have a good idea of what your goal is.
Yeah, this is why for instance, on Lumio, when you start a new Lumio instance, you begin with your purpose, right? Because goal formation can help quite a lot in achieving things. I even have this other book here. What is it? This one, Theory U. It's backwards, I guess, mirrored. But it is entirely this huge book, which is entirely about goal formation in groups. But Beer is right that in many cases, that's just not something you can easily access. You're probably going to be more effective if you can, but let's consider the case where that's more of a big question mark, because that's a very common case in interaction. All right. So, Jeremy, go ahead.
I think this dovetails nicely into what happens in the bulk of the chapter, where Beer is comparing algorithms with heuristics. Because, what Beer is basically saying is that we think in terms of algorithms, but the heuristics are really the only way we can tackle these exceedingly complex systems. So he's setting up all of these exceedingly complex systems and saying, go for it. How are you going to control the sea? And then he says, well, what if we dropped the concept of control from an algorithmic control to a heuristic control? And so that's why this is a huge idea that really governs the entire VSM, is to use heuristics where an algorithm can't possibly tackle the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Rudy, go ahead.
You're muted, Kyle.
I said, Rudy, go ahead. Thanks. I was muted on the software side. I have a hardware mute, and it's confusing me a bit here. Rudy, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this heuristics versus algorithm. And even if it sounds very intuitive, I'm not sure where you can put a line between them. You know what I mean? Like, this is like, oh, of course, just go up is a heuristic, but that's also an algorithm in a way. Just go up, right? If this direction is up, then use this one. It's a bit weird. I mean, I understand what he's trying to say, but it's not that clean. Like machine learning, one could argue is an algorithm, but it's way more of a heuristic, the way a neural network learns, than it is a precise algorithm.
Steve?
Yeah, can you hear me? Good, okay. I was really taken by this heuristic versus algorithm thing. I mean, on one sense, I agree really with what you're saying, right? The sort of notion that like go up is an algorithm, fine. But the idea that like you can apply heuristics when you don't even necessarily know the goal that you want to get to, which he emphasized a number of times, right? So that my interpretation there was like the algorithm is, this is the goal that I specifically want to get to, and here's all the steps to get there. Whereas, the heuristic will just point you to the direction. Maybe you get there, and when you're there, you can realize, oh, this is where I was supposed to be, or where I was trying to get to all along. And looping back to something we said before we got into the details, what was really interesting to me was this notion that like translating the meta language idea to how that turns into heuristics versus algorithms, right? Like how you can communicate the heuristics sort of down the chain such that turns into effectively local search, which sounds hard, and curious to see how that plays out. But I hadn't really thought about it in that way. Like you want to just nudge the system along in a communicable way. And you need to find the ways to express that. What he doesn't talk about, though, of course, is that local heuristics aren't necessarily going to get you to where you need to go. And I think he kind of talks about how, what we saw based on the discussion from chapter 2, I think, which is that the heuristics don't need to be perfect, but inevitably the feedback will sort of put you in the right direction. But that's not always true, right? Local search gets you into local minima, and that can be a problem. That's all.
Right. Very good points. And Justin, and then we'll go to Matt.
Yes, a little bit about the difference between heuristics and algorithms. I think, Rudy, you had a really good point that the distinction really isn't clear at all. And I'm wondering, I don't know, maybe... I think we all have multiple heuristics and just rules of thumb guiding us along. So maybe it could be something like, but each one of those rules of thumb might be able to be expressed kind of algorithmically. So maybe it's sort of like a probabilistic switching between multiple algorithms, something like that, when you're working heuristically rather than algorithmically.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I forgot exactly where it was in the chapter, but one of the things he mentions is having a meta optimizer that's also optimizing over what time horizon you're paying attention to. I thought that was that rang true is just a very that's just part of the process of especially when it comes to limitations of local search and stuff. I've heard of trading strategies and how one of the things that you have to think about is what is the time frame of this? Is this something where if it's not making money after a week, you should abandon it, or is it something where it's over the time frame of a month, and exactly what the horizon is part of one of these systems.
Yeah, and I guess that's applicable to both algorithms and heuristics, right? That you would probably have algorithms that are designed to certain timescales, and then heuristics as well. We have heuristics about getting ready for winter by saving up stuff, right? And so that's a kind of seasonal heuristic. but it doesn't prescribe a specific course of action so much as a class of actions to be taken. All right. So why don't we take a quick look at what exactly Beer says about these two things, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the ambiguity between them, maybe. So page 52, he says, the first of these terms is algorithm. An algorithm is a technique or a mechanism which prescribes how to reach a fully specified goal. So, plotting a flight plan, finding a square root. A method of finding the square root is an algorithm, and so is a computer program. The last is important because we shall soon have to clear up some confusion about the capabilities of computers. A computer can do only what it is precisely told to do. The programmer has to write an algorithm then, which will exactly determine the computer's next move in any set of circumstances, whatever. The second of the terms we shall need is heuristic. This is an English adjective, not often used perhaps, meaning serving to find out, which has been turned into a noun by contracting an heuristic method into an heuristic. An heuristic specifies a method of behaving which will tend towards a goal which cannot be precisely specified because we know what it is, but not where it is. So suppose you're trying to reach the peak of a conical mountain enveloped in cloud. It must have a highest point, but you don't know the compass bearing. The instruction keep going up will get you there wherever there is. That is an heuristic. Take care of the pence and the pounds will look after themselves is an attempted heuristic for being wealthy. Heuristics prescribe general rules for reaching general goals then, and do not typically prescribe an exact route to a located goal as does an algorithm. There are, after all, an infinite number of paths up the mountain, and it does not matter much which path is taken, although some routes may be quicker than others. These two notions are very important in cybernetics, for in dealing with unthinkable systems it is normally impossible to give a full specification of a goal, and therefore impossible to prescribe an algorithm. But it is not usually too difficult to prescribe a class of goals, so that moving in some general direction will leave you better off by some definite criterion than you were before. To think in terms of heuristics rather than algorithms is at once a way of coping with proliferating variety. Instead of trying to organize it in full detail, you organize it only somewhat. You then ride on the dynamics of the system in the direction you want to go. Does that really help us understand this any better? That an algorithm has a fully specified goal and a heuristic does not. Jay, go ahead, and then Matt.
Maybe that is just the definitions that he's using, and we can't really read that much more into them. But I was just going to say that, like, I can imagine heuristics that do have fully specified goals, right? Like one could be, keep warm for the winter is maybe a fully specified goal, and then the heuristic is just that, and then you do what you need to do to fulfill that heuristic, I guess. So yeah, for me it's not, but maybe those are the definitions that you've just read out there. So maybe then that it is as clear as it seems, or as we're overcomplicating it or something.
Matt, and then Steve.
I'm thinking maybe maybe the way they taught this in the UK in the 50s was different, because he's just literally describing a search algorithm, but maybe they didn't call those algorithms in the 50s, because I guess operations research and stuff was sort of a different field. So I feel like maybe we're just dealing with some terminological drift, because if you crack open an algorithms textbook, he's just using nice language to describe the third thing you'll say. So I think maybe he just means here things that things that are sort of a little bit more unpredictable, and so just job shop scheduling and traveling salesman stuff and search versus like stuff that's like a little bit more predictable. Like I feel like that's just what he's sort of getting at, or maybe just something that incorporates feedback.
Yeah, fair enough. And Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interpreting his what he's trying to say in kind of like more like choices, right? The heuristic at every point of the what you're doing, like there's a choice that you need to make on how to proceed. At the end of it, right, you've made a series of choices that you can string together and say, like, this is the plan to how I get there, and that's the algorithm, right? And that's like, that exists. It doesn't matter how you decided that, but the heuristics are the instantaneous choices that you need to make along the way. But yeah, I mean, I think, obviously I think there is some like historical ambiguity here with how this is coming, like how he's arriving at these sorts of semantics.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I guess we just need to bear in mind then going forward that by algorithm, he means an algorithm with a fully specified goal, and by heuristic, he means an algorithm with a generally specified goal. So yeah, that's kind of what we're working with here. So next goes on to talking about the dissimilarity between the two approaches. The strange thing is that we tend to live our lives by heuristics and try and control them by algorithms. Our general endeavor is to survive, yet we specify in detail, catch the 8:45 train, ask for a raise, how to get this unspecified and unspecifiable goal. We certainly need these algorithms in order to live coherently, but we also need heuristics, and we are rarely conscious of them. This is because our education is planned around detailed analysis. We do not, we learn, really understand things unless we can specify their infrastructure. The point came up before in the discussion of transfer functions, and now it comes up again in connection with goals. Know where you are going and organize to get there could be the motto foisted on us and onto our firms. And yet we cannot know the future. We can only have rough ideas as to what we or our firms want, and we do not understand our environment well enough to manipulate events with certitude. Birds evolved from reptiles, it seems. Did a representative body of lizards pass a resolution to fly? If so, by what means could the lizards have organized their genetic variety to grow wings? One has only to say such things to recognize them as ridiculous, but the birds are flying this evening outside my window. This is because heuristics work while we are still sucking the pencil which would like to prescribe an algorithm. So a very nice little example there. Yeah, I mean, I think this is like getting to sort of that pragmatism connection. This is definitely sort of getting to the Deweyan principles of education, right? Being able to do sort of like critical problem solving and experimentation in the classroom and that kind of stuff. And absolutely, I have encountered as a teacher the problem of, know where you're going and organize to get there, or the problem of detailed analysis as the be-all and end-all, because, when I was teaching English in Japan, I would just like take my students outside and get them to describe things in practical terms, because like they had never used English outside of a testing or classroom context. And so I was trying to say, like, use the language for something. Just like get your head around the idea that this language could actually be used for something, as opposed to just being its only utility being to get you test marks, to get you a better job. And it's a major challenge because you're up against the whole education system when you try to do that. So Third Creed, go ahead.
I raised my hand to riff on what you were saying, and then I realized how off of the point this might be. But just I was going to say that I was my first degree was in music composition, and I was in like the academies for music, and like that's that's been my experience of like how the academy teaches is like people stop using music practically, or think about how it's to be used, or think about why people have used music for the last, however long humans have been doing musical things. And it becomes there's a focus on not just on the craft of music making, which would be fine, but on sort of just music to pass exams and music, and it's like a really big cultural problem. But that's just a riff on what you were saying. It really doesn't probably contribute much to the fundamental conversation.
No, I mean, I think that's good to hear, because there's many contexts in which this happens, and they tend to be isolated from each other, right? Like, I have my experiences with language teaching or philosophy teaching, but I have never really been in a music classroom and seen that whole process. So it's really good to hear, however, 100 plus years after Dewey, or we're getting there, I guess we're getting close to 100, that, and however many, thousands upon thousands of education majors who have been taught Dewey there are, we still get really kind of similar outcomes. Okay, so that's a very good point. All good points all around. So moving on then. So the failure to understand the role of heuristics in complex systems at large slops over into much computer thinking. The computer itself can be analyzed, can be understood in detail. After all, we designed it. We've already declared roundly that a computer program is an algorithm. Some thought is therefore needed to understand where heuristics come into the computer picture. First, the need for them arises once the computer becomes alive with fast-flowing information. If we know what we are trying to do with the input data, such as striking the average of a list of figures, which then constitutes the output, there is no difficulty. Blah, blah, blah. The whole thing is simple because we have specified the goal, the system, and the algorithm, and has largely forgotten the entire arrangement to proliferate variety. Once the concern is to link a high variety input with a high variety output, however, we have the basis for an anastomotic reticulum. Now the computer needs to be programmed. That is, needs supplying with an algorithm that will organize the reticulum, and this can be done only if there is a known goal. The subtle point is this. If the goal is not recognized in detail, a heuristic is required, so the computer must be supplied with an algorithm determining a heuristic. That is the basic trick. Suppose we say the computer must learn from its own experience, as do we ourselves. Learn what? We do not know. What we meant was that the computer must find out over a period, by trial and error, the courses of action which lead to better results of control. We shall say what is a better and a worse result, but the computer has to determine a better strategy, a better control system than we ourselves know. And of course it can do it, because its algorithm, what it is programmed to do, specifies a heuristic. Alter the solution you are now using a little bit, says the algorithm, and compare the outcome with the erstwhile outcome. If this is more profitable or cheaper or whatever else we say, adopt it. Go on like this until any variation you make leads to a worse result than you already have, then hang on to the solution until the situation changes, whereupon you may do better once again by producing a new variation. In this simple, innocuous statement, which a child could follow, we have the secret of the essentially biological process. Here he's saying that computer algorithms which deal with variety specify a heuristic. Now, when we deal with something like machine learning, do we think that the computer is doing more heuristic formulation, or is it still just heuristic specification that we're talking about here? So, Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was reticent about putting my hands up because it wasn't exactly to do with machine learning, but I have this other thing in my head, which is genetic algorithms.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because, he brings up the evolution example so much in this chapter, and I was reading when genetic algorithms really took off. and it was later in the decade that he wrote this book. I wonder how he would have written it if it was a little later. But in genetic algorithms, you have this idea called the building block hypothesis, where the individuals being the individuals being evolved, like sections of their representation can become quote unquote chosen by the genetic algorithm, and like I guess those could be said to be like learned heuristics. Like the heuristic could be like, oh god, I don't know, like actually maybe not, but like so if the list that is represents the individual as like a plan, then I guess you could say the heuristic is like this section of a plan works well in this area of the environment. That's what came to my mind. That's the best I could do with what I know about this stuff anyway. But apart from that.
Third Creed, go ahead.
No, I didn't realize my mic was on. My bad.
No problem.
I said to myself, I thought, he's a cool guy.
Nice. Nice.
Who's a cool guy?
Jay, I think it's you. Hey, compliments are allowed in this this space. Sorry, Third Creed. I just mixed up your mic icon with your hand up icon. Nico, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I've been reading one of the major influences for Moore in the Electrical Biologist by Levins and Lewontin. And they're discussing this kind of like, this genetic selection process, the kind of like, Darwinian dominant view of like the kind of key to a lock or adapting to a niche, if you will. And a lot of what they say in that chapter, what Moore really builds upon, is that it's not just the species itself being molded into a niche, but the species itself modifying, probably even minimizing the variety of the environment through its own, for example, beavers modifying hydrology. Or I think further to explain this another way is that like the species might modify through their usage of the environment to minimize their own, variety they would deal with. Like might move through a forest to, kind of like statistically average like the patchiness of resources, if you will. So just wanted to like add another side to it beyond like this kind of passive kind of selection, optimization, this kind of active modification of the environment to minimize variety. So.
Yeah, and this is really a famous phenomenon with like search algorithms, right? Like, the way in which journalism has been altered to be amenable to the Facebook algorithm, right? In order to get clicks. The algorithm in its process of optimization is changing its environment as well. So yeah, that's a big part to consider in this too. Okay. So then, the other thing I just wanted to mention is like, this really again reminds me of Dewey, because one of Dewey's big things is like, he started out his career as a Hegelian, and it was the influence of biology upon him that caused him to break with Hegelianism and to start to develop his form of pragmatic philosophy. And I think there's this real big undercurrent of biological thinking informing this sort of philosophical or pragmatic thinking as well. All right, so let's go on. We've talked about ecology a little bit, the sort of things that are being discussed here. It says, the genetic heuristic works towards the unknown goal, a form of life that is competent to survive in circumstances and by techniques which are too complicated to analyze and for which there exists no optimizing computer. And I guess this kind of gets to that like idea of everything is trying to survive that Beer's talking about. But I guess like that that sort of like selection or optimization process that is not like computed by any computer is kind of the bridge between like the biological sphere of thinking and like the computational sphere of thinking for beer here. So that's probably important too. Okay, so he gets to his several important points about heuristic control, which ought to be carefully considered and appreciated. So we will go through all of these, I guess, if everyone's okay with that. Maybe we'll just read them out one by one and talk about them. So first one, I really get tripped up by the British spelling here of an heuristic instead of a heuristic. Is that a British thing?
We don't do that anymore.
We don't do that anymore. Okay. It's very, very. It's just my editor brain gets really disrupted every time I read that. All right. An heuristic will take us to a goal we can specify, but do not know, and perhaps cannot even recognize when we reach it. The algorithm, such as to get to the highest point, try one step in each direction and move to the next higher position, specifying this heuristic, stipulates the eventual discovery of a strategy. The strategy says the best thing to do is to go up here for so far, round this, along that, then up the other. This strategy cannot be worked out in advance. All right. So here again, we have the relationship between the heuristic and the algorithm. So earlier, Bure seemed to kind of like state this algorithm as a heuristic, but here is now calling it an algorithm. So I do think that ambiguity is preserved. This, go up, keep going up kind of approach. It's just a little bit more specified in this formulation. But I do think it's interesting, this idea of moving from a heuristic to a strategy as like a higher level formulation. Is, I don't know, what do people think about that? Is that how we strategize? I guess. Jay, go ahead.
It reminds me of a way of framing something in kind of sandbox environments to do with like building, I guess, like agents that can move around in a world. Like I forget all of the terminology, so I'm sorry for anyone who's listening who knows it. But like it's like hierarchical actions basically, where like lower level actions are like turn left, turn right, like go forward one step, and then like you build these into like not just like a list of actions, but like a class of actions that all look like the same sort of list of actions. And that is what I kind of think of as a strategy. So like instead of in a room, you're like saying to get to that doorway, I do left, 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 forward, forward, left, left, forward. The strategy becomes walk to the door. And the strategy walk to the door is composed of the actions, any number of actions that would get you to the door, right? But the strategy is to get to the door, and the actions that compose it might be kind of different depending on what you want to do. I'm not sure if that's what he's getting at, or if that's a different thing entirely.
Yeah, it seems kind of like what is being described here as a strategy is like a kind of like a completed plan for how to implement the heuristic. Third Creed, go ahead.
I know I'm talking too much. It reminds me of discrete optimization. There's this thing called simulated annealing, right? And there's a thing called like a taboo search. And those remind me of, there's sort of like meta heuristics on the heuristic of just climb the mountain and get to the tight point. But you get to a local optimum then. So how do you get to your global optimum? You can use these other sort of meta strategies of like, don't go to places you've already been for exploration, or like don't get too certain too quickly or something like that. I don't know if it's the kind of thing he's talking about, but it's what I thought of.
Yeah, definitely. They're like, they're exact. That's really interesting, having like heuristics to correct your heuristics. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I've just been diving into this, but I know like the bleeding edge of reinforcement learning is stuff about like policies and like hierarchical learning, and which is it's kind of wild that's the snake's kind of eating its own tail, but like they're really like I guess like the computers like weren't there yet in his day, but I mean like. Yeah, I see a lot of consonants. Actually, there's even there's a paper that came out like in January, hierarchical reinforcement learning for open domain dialogue, which I've not read this, but I saved it on the assumption that it would be important at some point, and feels like this sounds like exactly what he's talking about.
Awesome, that's really cool to hear. All right, so let's move on to number 2. If we give a computer the algorithm which operates the heuristic and wait for it to evolve a strategy, we may find that the computer has invented a strategy beyond our own ability to understand. This is quite possible insofar as it can make trials more quickly, more systematically, and more accurately than we can without pausing for play or rest and without forgetting the results. It is just like a man who plays chess all the time and memorizes all the lessons of all the games. We expect him to beat casual players like ourselves. I mean, we've seen this computer do this thing in our lifetime, right? Beat the best player. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is pretty familiar to all of us these days. Jay, go ahead.
3, 4, and 5 all seem like pretty similar points about like what computers can and can't do.
Sure. And
they reminded me of like Alan Turing's paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, where he talks about Ada Lovelace's objection, or Lady Lovelace's objection. Sorry, I mixed it up with the name Ada, right? Yeah. And he's talking about computers can't think, and Lady Lovelace says the analytical engine, like it'll just do what it's told and this kind of stuff. He's saying like, well, it will do what it's told, and I think Beer says here explicitly, if you tell it to learn, it can do that too.
Right. Yeah. So to take a quick look at 3, 4, and 5, so in what sense is a machine more intelligent than humanity? Yeah, it's exactly what you're describing there. If the machine ends up with a better strategy than we have got, and if we cannot understand why it is better, but only that it is small consolation to know that we taught it the heuristic trick by an algorithm. Einstein's primary school teacher was in much the same position. So yeah, just because you taught someone who's way smarter than you doesn't mean you're smarter than them. Again, this is like something we're super familiar with from everyday machine learning applications. All right, number 4. The argument that computers can only do what they're told is correct, but highly misleading. It suggests that they must remain the moronic slaves of their inventors. In fact, if we are telling them to learn and giving them a training algorithm, but they learn more efficiently than we do and must pass us in the ability to achieve heuristic control. 5, the argument that the output of a computer is only as good as its input, summed up in the phrase garbage in, garbage out, is true for algorithms specifying algorithms, but not for algorithms specifying heuristics, for it is easy to tell algorithmically the computer to suspect heuristically its own input, to test it for consistency. See how this happens. If one input line pumps in data which do not correlate with anything else in the system, the likelihood is that this input is probably a random disturbance noise rather than information. The heuristic can then begin to diminish the weight its control strategy gives this input. If it then mixes only 0.9 of the suspect input with every whole unit of every other input, and the result is better control, it will try 0.8 and so on until the garbage input is ignored altogether. Please note, we shall not understand why this has happened because we are very bad at intuiting statistical correlations and may well have a strong belief that the garbage input is terribly important. But the system will have eliminated its misleading source of information just the same. So, that's promising. Matt, go ahead. You're muted, Matt. Go ahead.
Yeah, the last one of number 5, and particularly what like reminded me of deep learning, because like you actually can like feed it garbage and like it'll still get smarter from it, or you can feed it data that's just like you want it to separate dogs from cats, showing it bulldozers as as long as it's still more pictures, will actually still like make it better at doing that. So the garbage in, garbage out, doesn't really apply there. Really, just the more data, the better. Kind of the dirtier, not necessarily the dirtier, the better. But I mean, like having a certain amount of dirty data is good for that. And also, but they're also very hard to interpret, which is, is very prescient.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is really interesting stuff because. It just goes like so totally against every intuition about fidelity and about sort of like research practice, right? Like you want, like generally speaking, when you're doing research, you want to start with good data and research off that. The idea that you can sort of like feed noisy data in and get better results is like very counterintuitive. All right. So, Matt, go ahead.
I actually another thing of like with like 3 and 4, I think it kind of goes back to the impossibility of intelligence explosion paper, and you're saying that like for now, like we're only training you with things to really be good at a very narrow task, but ultimately it's like what we want it to be. And like what we don't really have is a system where a chess playing AI could maybe learn how to play Go. Though even that's like theoretically possible. Like you could formalize and formulate it, of like have a payoff of like what games are good to learn and then tell it where the data is. But what we don't really have, and this I guess kind of would be the architecture for it, is something that really could decide what its objectives are. And that's what's scary. Though for now, I would say even if the computers are that, the socio-technical infrastructure is still doing that. like Facebook as a whole, the surveillance industrial complex as a whole is doing this, even if no algorithm that Facebook is going to make is going to do this.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. We see that kind of adaptation in organizations. Like I think the CPUSSR is a great example of that, right? Like where you start with certain goals in mind and you try to formulate heuristics for following them, and then you end up with a completely different organization. So, yeah. Okay, number 7. 6. The mechanism we are using is precisely the old servo mechanism discussed much earlier, in which error-correcting feedback is derived by comparator from actual outcomes contrasted with ideal outcomes. But the outcome is measured not in terms of the input data transformed by a transfer function, but in terms of the whole system's capacity to improve on its results as measured in another language. So whole system's capacity to improve on its results as measured in another language. This is the language in which we say it is better to increase or decrease the value of the output, which the closed system itself could not know. For instance, if the output of the system measures profitability, and the system has a heuristic which produces fluctuations in profit, which it learns how to extinguish or to reinforce, it must be told that higher profits are better and lower profits are worse. All it can learn for itself is that some patterns of event push profit up and others down. So yeah, exactly what you were saying there, Matt. All right, let's keep going. 7. Secondly, the servo mechanism's feedback does not operate on the forward transfer function as such. It operates on the organization of the black box which houses the transfer function. That is, it experiments with the connectivity of the anastomotic reticulum. As effective structure emerges, this is what cuts down the capacity to proliferate variety. Okay, I think this is actually pretty important, so we might want to talk about this one a little bit. This idea of operating on the organization of the black box. This is really quite interesting, because so I guess is he saying here that the servo mechanism itself does not understand the particulars of the transfer function mechanism. It's just operating on the transfer function as a black box. Sorry, I was saying, are there aspects of the machine that are black box to its own understanding? Because, like, we often think about the machine as a whole as a black box, but there may actually be black boxing within the black box itself. Third Creed and then Matt, go ahead.
I'm going to defer to Matt because I was going to talk about neural nets. And I was like,
Okay.
This is what I keep thinking about, like how it changes itself internally. That feels like a rearrangement of connectivity of an anatomic, and I can't say that word, reticulum to get the results it wants, and then like the side it's looking at the results it gets, then it, that's some sort of meta language on top of the neural net. But I think Matt has some expertise in this area, so I'm going to defer to him for that comment.
All right, go ahead, Matt.
Right on, no, definitely. That sounds right. But I was actually going to go for like so I mean, you can't really communicate directly with like your with your adrenal glands to change the amount of adrenaline that they're producing. Like, like you are operating at multiple levels of abstraction, and like actually there are channels like between your brain and other parts. But I mean, like your conscious self, your little homunculus, the little monster in the pineal gland, like it can't actually just like go and reach into to cells and like make them start producing more or less of a hormone.
Right. If we want to increase our adrenal levels, then maybe we'll watch a scary movie. But that's a very imprecise interaction with our adrenal system. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's a pretty important point to bear in mind going forward, because it does definitely have bearing on the VSM and its structure. All right. Number 8. Although paragraphs 6 and 7 above give better ways of thinking about the servo mechanism, they do not appear to change the mathematics which govern its stability. Hence, the conclusion, chapter 2, that feedback dominates the outcome still holds. Hence, everything depends on the other language criteria, which the system is given to decide what to learn and what to unlearn. So, I think here about the example of like mutualism or co-ops, right? It's like, well, yeah, no, the language you're specifying there is good, but the meta language feedback is going to totally fuck over your aims from the overall capitalist market system. So yeah, that's pretty important. Number 9. Then suppose the control system has become so effective and has learned so well that it is now more intelligent than we are. Perhaps we shall no longer be clever enough to specify these other language criteria that it should use. We may no longer understand what they are. In that case, there must be another control system, using the output of the first system as input, and operating in another plane. This higher order, other language system would experiment with the fluctuating outputs of the first system and produce new outputs in the other plane. Feedback from there, compared with some other planned criteria, would establish the meaning of better and worse for the first system. For example, the first system might be controlling production to produce more or less of each product, utilizing all the plant. The second system would then evaluate this in terms of market demand, taking the output, profitability, and telling the first system whether to learn higher or lower production strategies for each product. So this is the what is it? The U machine that is described in the cybernetic brain. The machine that Beer tried to make for the steel plant using the pond. I think he's describing this kind of mechanism here, right? In number 9. Jeremy, go ahead. Oh, you're muted. Yeah, it's still muted. It must be on the hardware level. It's not on the software level. Okay. Someone else want to speak to this point? Does this sort of describe in general what Beer was aiming for with that example?
Could I ask for you to elaborate on how it relates to the pond example? Because like the only thing I wrote in the margin here was that higher level control systems and strategies feed into lower level control systems and strategies.
Oh,
I may
yeah.
have missed
So
a deeper point, really.
Yeah, he's just saying like, we get a, yeah, I think if I remember correctly, the machine that interfaced with the market itself was the first machine, and then the second machine was the one that actually provided the equilibrium. So that's what I remember from that example in the book, but I'd have to go back and look at it again to see if he's like really just drawing on his experience. I guess it's kind of beside the point, but I thought it is a little interesting to see in this book where like he's drawing on examples you've seen elsewhere and just being like, oh yeah, I see, this is like based on that experience, or yeah, would have been nice to have like an annotated version, but I guess that's a little bit much to ask.
Yeah, it would have been nice to have Shane here to riff off that, actually.
Yeah, totally. All right, so, but we understand the point, right? Is that the maximizing, like, essentially, we end up with a machine that produces outcomes that are too complex for us to understand. So we need another machine or a meta language to evaluate the desirability of those outcomes. And this actually reminds me a lot also of if you've ever read oh, it's all backwards again. Ernst Cassirer. If you're familiar with Cassirer at all, he was a very famous neo-Kantian who was around at the same time as like Carnap and Heidegger and that. And he wrote this book, The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, that is about sort of meta-elaboration of symbolic forms. That just, I don't know, this really reminded me of that. Was influential in his time and then became very not so after World War II. Okay, let's move on though. We got to keep this moving. So the criterion of profitability in turn might not be specifiable. Human thinking tends to give up the ghost when trying to compare short-term and long-term profitabilities. A short-run maximum profit strategy may break the firm in terms of goodwill and lead to bankruptcy. Then, clearly, the second system needs a third system to evaluate its outputs in a higher order language and to say what counts as more or less profitable. The third system would experiment heuristically with the time base of the second system's economic evaluations. So, like, I don't know, maybe these systems exist today, but certainly it's interesting because, like, it's almost like at that level you're talking about something that's beyond simply an algorithm and, like, is about the system's interaction with the legal system. Like, you know, because you have these, like, legal requirements to your shareholders to produce dividends and so on. Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, this reminded me that profitability is not a simple goal. Because I was thinking that until I got to this point 10. It's like short-term, long-term profitability is okay, yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of taking into account the long-term probabilities, then that involves like forming higher level systems, really, doesn't it? Rather than just working within the firm system, you kind of have to form like cabals with other companies, really, to like say, you know, let's not develop technology in this way because it's going to hurt all of our profits, more of that kind of stuff, right? So it's more than the firm at this point. If you're thinking like that goal leads you to, like, I guess, deterritorialize would maybe be the word. I was reading Shane's stuff the other day. Some other parts of other firms.
Right. Yeah. You might end up in like a kind of like Zaibatsu kind of situation where they're doing like profit sharing across or Keidetsu, like profit sharing across firms and stuff. Third Creed, go ahead.
Just going to real quickly add that kind of thing was mentioned by Ralph Miliband when he's commenting on like the role of the state. He was saying like the state often functions as that thing, which is like, hey, don't eat yourself up too much. You need that to survive or whatever. That the state will actually function against capitalist immediate interest and in its long-term interest.
Yeah, definitely. That is like an idea that you see in the German ideology a little bit, but definitely in Miliband for sure. Well, that's interesting. So this third level algorithm is actually the state. Well, who knew? Okay. All right. So this argument continues until the hierarchy of systems and the levels of language that go with them reach some form of ultimate criterion. What is this? It can only be survival. The firm, like the man, makes things in order to be rewarded, in order to show a profit, in order to continue to make things, and so on, round and round, in order to perhaps to generate all sorts of side effects, in order to go on being. So, interesting here. It's like, this is certainly the argument I'm familiar with from Marcuse in terms of arguing that capitalism is irrational, right? Because Marcuse has this really strong Aristotelian influence as well. And he says, like, basically, capitalism is hostile to life, so it's irrational because the logic of life it dictates survival, and capitalism is driving towards extinction. So, this is sort of like, we don't have a meta system to organize at this ultimate criterion level. We have lower level systems, but we don't have that. So that's quite an interesting point as well. All right. And what is true of the firm in this generation of management and true of this man, son of his father, becomes true of the firm as a continuing entity in perpetuity and of all men, fathers of their sons. That is the training process for here and now as the evolutionary process for the epochs ahead. Interestingly, this really reminds me of the Thomist, or like the natural law argument against abortion, right here. What he's saying in terms of survival, the father begets the son and so on and so on. They have this interest in progeny. Therefore, that is natural. Therefore, abortion is unnatural and should not be done. So again, coming directly out of Aristotle. Two rather different takes. Jay, go ahead.
Not even really just a substantial comment, but that comment you just made just reminded me that the word viable for a child outside the woman's body is kind of, I guess, related to all of this. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you could sort of make a Beerian counter argument to the natural law theory against abortion, and sort of saying, well, but no, you need a meta system to determine what is really viable.
Matt, go ahead.
I really do like groove on the whole like his his like layers of systems of like your sense of taste is one system. Like you can't stop finding sweet things like a certain level of pleasurable. I mean, except when something kind of higher level kicks in and starts maybe making you nauseous. When but like the experience of it will still be what it is. Like, and one doesn't like override the other. Like like they're both there. It's just that there's this one that's like usually like a good bet in most situations. Usually steer you right. But there's this other system that's not always talking to you. That like will just occasionally snap you out of that. And like that's cool. I like that.
Yeah, and you can also have like the feedback from the higher system down to the lower one, right? Like where your adult sense of taste is going to be quite different from your childhood sense of taste, because you have different nutritional needs. Anyway, that's an interesting thing there. Okay, so when it is said that a heuristic organizes a system to learn by trying out a new variation in its operational control strategy, we might equally have said that a heuristic organizes a family of systems to evolve by trying out a new mutation in its genetic control strategy. And he says he's dealt with this at length in Decision and Control. The aim of adaptation is identical. So, again, something we're super familiar with from like deep learning and stuff these days. All right. So then we get on to meta-languages. So meta-language is a language of a higher order in which propositions written in a lower order language may be discussed. In logic, the basis of meta-languages really are abstruse. It can be shown that virtually any logical language must contain propositions whose truth or falsity cannot be settled within the framework of that language. Logical paradoxes are the familiar example. So here we're talking like ultimately about Gödel and the incompleteness theorem, right? Jeremy, go ahead. Oh. You still can't hear you, Jeremy.
Do you have a phone you could connect to Jitsi through?
That might work. Oh. Okay. All right. Yeah, so someone else, do you have a comment then about incompleteness and meta-languages? All right, Jay, go ahead.
It's not exactly an interesting comment, but I guess in the absence of anything else, is I at least know some stuff about this. So like in like a theorem proving system, the meta language would be the theorem proving system itself, and within that system you can define object logics, where you can, and then working with those logics you can get them to prove things, but you can also like describe the properties of the object logic itself, like whether or not it's consistent, like what propositions it can't prove, but the meta logic can't say anything about itself. So you would have to use a different theorem prover, embed that meta logic within that theorem prover, and then say stuff about it in there.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the language can't speak about itself in a certain kind of sense that's very deep. It's hard to really sum up, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really, reading about the history of like the sort of foundation of mathematics debate, and about Hilbert's program and Gödel and all that stuff. What I was really blown away by was how after Hilbert's program failed, there were all these intellectuals who didn't like really despair about it, about the lack of completeness or the impossibility of completeness. They were just like, oh no, we'll just go and work with that. And that seems very much to be what Beer is doing here as well. And that was always something a little bit hard for me to wrap my head around. But I definitely find it very interesting here. I think I will just read out Jeremy's comments, and then we'll go to you, Matt. So Jeremy says that the platform for change is written with a text and a metalinguistic text that addresses the text. So, Beer is exactly following his advice here. And also that platform characterizes a government as a metasystem to society as a system. So again, like totally agrees with what Miliband was saying with like Marxist state theory about how the state is there to regulate capitalism. Finally, from Stafford Beer's point of view, the metasystem should only kick in when the system is out of whack, and therefore government should only exist when society gets out of whack and should not prod it back into working properly. So, in a certain sense, we could say that, in a limited way, the governments that are dealing with COVID-19 right now and are trying to evaluate when the ideal point is to do capitalism again, are really doing their job, right? Like, they're functioning in a very Beerian sense relative to capitalism. It's just that perhaps capitalism is not a viable system. So, yeah. but the description of the state is on point. All right, Matt, let's go to you.
Oh damn! I think when we talk about like nationalizing industries or whatever, like the thing is that I think we go to that because government is right now like the only institution in our lives that actually has meaningful democratic channels. While like Beer was always talking about like actually just making democratic channels like throughout the entire economy, throughout the entire society, and so like that does make sense because like we associate government with like slightly less psychopathic policies because it's still it's non-hyper-authoritarian thing that is capable of looking more than 5 steps ahead and can actually think of like long-term survivability. But yeah, I mean, like he wants to bake that resilience like into the rest of society. Also, yeah, like just got into Miliband. It is the first Marxist state theory that I agree with at all. I just read Coup in Chile, and that was dope. With the Gerdell stuff, though, what I was originally going to say was, the way you sidestep that is, have just be okay with like multiple mutually, inconsistent paradigms, and just have like some way of flitting between them, and you just gotta roll with that because it's not that completeness is impossible, it's just that consistency and completeness is impossible. If you're okay with a little bit of inconsistency, it's fine. And also empiricism, like I see why Beer orients himself around feedback because incompleteness is only about like the eternal world of forms and how it doesn't actually exist. He killed Plato, but like in the real world, which it's fine because you can take observations from reality.
Yeah, ironic given Gödel's other intellectual commitments. He's definitely not an empiricist. But anyway, that's beside the point. All right, let's move on with that in mind. Okay, so we get to the sort of toy example in this chapter. I found this example to be a little bit hard to follow. I think it would be greatly aided by an animation. Just seeing the machine move, I think would help so much in making this comprehensible. So go ahead, Third Creed.
When I was reading this, like I think about a year ago, I made an animation of it, or actually it's a little piece of, it's a code pen, and I'll link it here. It looks like garbage. Like I made it so I could understand that it's not for presentation.
Okay.
That sounds actually awesome. Says at the end of this that he made one himself, right?
Oh, really? That's very good. So so like again, this is it's just the lack of motion that I think it conveys or causes a lack of clarity here, because it's describing a moving system through text and a static picture. But otherwise, I think it's a pretty good example. So, okay. Again, it's a little bit difficult to discuss this example easily, but essentially it is a machine with 10 nodes and 2 possible outcomes, right? And the probability between the 2 outcomes is going to be adjusted by the orientation of the connections within the machine. And there is a reward and punish button on the machine as well. And if you reward the machine, it will send it one way. You punish it, it will send it the other. So you can adjust the probabilities to get them more to the sort of green you like or the red you like. Is that the basics of what's being discussed here? Okay, yeah. All right. Okay, so we'll move on past the sort of, real detailed discussion to page 60 when he says, pause for a moment, however. Why does this first man, speaking meta 1, prefer red to green? It is just a psychological quirk. Now suppose a second man comes along who happens to be the first man's boss. He's observing the effect of these 2 lights in another context. He finds that when the green light goes on, someone gives him £10, but when the red light goes on, he is told to pay a £10 fine. At first, he tries to tell the meta 1 man about this. Change your preference to green, he says. I know how to make money that way, and I will share the proceeds with you. But the first man cannot understand him. He speaks meta 1, a language of aesthetics. He has not heard about money at all, and does not want to know. The second man is a speaker of meta language 2. How is he to convey his point, expressible in meta 2, alone to the meta 1 speaker? So this is quite interesting because this very closely sort of matches up with what Marx is going on about in the value form discussion in chapter 1 of Capital Volume 1, right? With the use value, exchange value dichotomy, where, money is the universal equivalent, is kind of providing a meta language to discuss all the different use values. But yeah, any comments about this first meta language example? Yeah, Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to chip in so often, but I just noted down a humorous example to me, at least. So my marginal comment was, for example, the boss only understands meta 2, the language of money. The workers have to translate their demands into this language. So they form a union and they make demands or else.
Totally. This is super interesting in terms of describing the contradictions of capitalism as a meta language translation problem. It's very, very interesting. Okay. Next example. Man 2 says to man 1, I hold you responsible for this machine. I am going abroad, but I am recording the greens and reds. If, when I return, I find that red has predominated, you will be replaced by another operator, and you will lose your bed and board in my house. But if green predominates, your room will be floodlit with the red light you enjoy. Note that it is no use trying to talk about money in Meta 1, which is an aesthetic language, and profitability is a notion which only Meta 2 speakers understand. The second Algodonic Loop translates Meta 2 into Meta 1, and Meta 1 can be translated into machine language by the first Algodonic Loop. If all this happens and man 1 succumbs, the operating procedure is reversed. He still does not know why the machine responds to his switches, and still less how. He no longer knows why he's due to produce an outcome, green, which goes against the grain for him. All he knows is expressed in the one language he understands, Meta 1, namely that it will be better in the long run for his color sense to start training the machine to shine green. To do this, he must press the reward switch whenever the green light shines, and the algorithmic receptor is so arranged that this and the punish switch for the red outcome pushes the wooden strip up. The fable we are recounting, however, really begins like this. Once upon a time, there were two philosophers discussing cupidity. They considered it possible that a man might be persuaded to undertake an entirely pointless task for a suitable reward. So, by way of a trial, they sent for a member of their staff. They told him that in another room was a box with an operator, and that the whole purpose of this box was to light either a red or green bulb. We will give you 10 pounds, they said, every time the green light comes on, but you will have to give us 10 pounds if the red bulb lights. They spoke to him, of course, in Meta 2, because that was his language, but they were really using an Algodonic Loop. He knew nothing about the test of his own greed, and had never spoken the philosophical language in which cupidity is discussed, which is called Meta 3. This can be continued indefinitely. So, this also reminds me a lot of the Republic. What Buer is providing in this fable here, right, is like, the men of gold are here discussing cupidity, and they tell the men of silver to go, make these demands upon the workers. Jay, go ahead.
I don't think we ever actually talked about what an algodonic loop was, and I don't totally grasp it myself, so maybe that would help. Okay,
absolutely. Let's have a look at it. So the Algodonic Loop,
I think it mostly starts to come up in the trainer and a dog bit on the end of
right. So he cannot explain in machine language, and the machine does not understand his language, so he communicates with the machine through an Algodonic Loop. And essentially, this is overcoming a linguistic barrier by means of reward and punishment, by means of essentially like operant conditioning. So yeah, I think that's all the Algodonic Loop is you use the carrot and the stick to communicate with someone who doesn't understand your language, because in some sense, reward and punish is a transcendental language. All right. It will be formulated in different terms in each different sub-language, but the principle of the Algodonic Loop holds. All right. So he's talking about just sort of infinite regress, meta-languages upon meta-languages upon meta-languages. But at some point, the nth framework must be reached, which, from this system's internal standpoint at least, will have to be declared an absolute framework. So here we get, like Hegel's response to, like Zeno's paradox or infinite regress, bad infinity, right? You have to impose a limitation on the system because limitation is the basis for freedom. If you're stuck in bad infinity, you just go on and on and on, and there's no organization. So in good logic, this cannot be done, but in practice, it has to be done. Hence, all finite systems are limited and incomplete. We ourselves, our firms, our economies, all suffer from this limitation. And because we do and must, the best possibility for change directed towards ever more successful adaptation lies in a reorganization of these hierarchies of command. We shall not beat the ultimate limitation like this, but we can choose its form. Coming up with the ultimate meta system is not really the solution, right? Because the ultimate meta system isn't ultimate in an absolute sense. It's ultimate in an arbitrary sense or a practical sense. any comments about this whole thing we've just gone over? Because I think this is the substance of what this section of the chapter covers. Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, just to echo what Third Creed just said in the chat, red light men of the world unite.
Nice. Yes. I want red light. I prefer Betamax to VHS. This is what I must have. It is my aesthetic language. All right. Okay. So Rudy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think kind of what I got from this was the point that if you don't leave room for error, you might never be able to recover it when you need it. And I'm also thinking about the way we have all this so-called trash DNA inside us, which is supposedly not used, even if that's another biological question. And all this stuff, like how nature tries to leave in some room by randomizing. I thought it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. Third Creed, go ahead.
Just reminds me of like I think you were discussing, Kyle, the other day about the fragility of capitalism, because it's like to be robust, you have to have redundancy, or that's one strategy. And if you're hyper efficient, then you aren't robust because you aren't redundant. And I don't know if that's exactly the logic, but you were saying something about this on the podcast the other day.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's like a sort of argument about systems fragility that's often applied to capitalism. That's like, yeah, if you're over-optimizing, you're limiting your capacity to deal with variety. And we've had really dramatic examples of that in reality just these days. All right, Matt.
Hello. Yeah, and to touch on the gene expression stuff, like we're finding, like, honestly, like we find a new version of this like every couple of months of like some way that junk DNA really isn't junk DNA, and like, we found like epigenetics and just how, like, colds can like change gene expression, and rules of neuroscience in particular, I like to say, is we don't really understand the brain, and like we are finding how much of neuron activity actually is like going after gene expression, which is like not only like totally different than like the synapse thing that they usually focus on, but also is kind of to what Beer's talking about with some of these things, operates on a very different time scale, because like a synapse, like a neuron firing happens in seconds. The gene expression thing happens over that's something that's over the course of days or weeks or whatever, and just like it's all this weird crap. It's
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, the rather basic example that comes to my mind when thinking about this sort of like the value of error, the value of noise, is like, something like the way that like dithering was done on the Sega Genesis, which relied on the blurriness of the image to produce a transparency effect. If you have a high fidelity screen, that intended signal is actually lost because there isn't enough noise in the picture to convey it. It's kind of interesting. And Jay, go ahead.
Are we coming towards the end of the chapter now?
Yep, we're just wrapping it up.
Okay, all right. So right at the end here, I have one last question, which is, again, this might be kind of just like a complete misunderstanding, but I'm trying to think of the ways to think of error. One is like a necessary part of good system dynamics, and on the other hand, possibly as like a signal that suggests change is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about what kinds of error are the errors you want, and maybe that's not the same for everyone, right? Maybe there's not an objective kind of error, that's good for everyone within the system, like for everything within the system, but is good for the system overall.
Beer says, the vital point is that mutations in the outcome should always be allowed. Error controlled to a reasonable level is not the absolute enemy we have been taught to think it. On the contrary, it is a precondition of survival. Immediately, the environment changes and begins to favor the green outcome. There's a chance-generated green result to reinforce, and the whole movement towards fresh adaptation begins too. The flirtation with error keeps the algodonic feedbacks toned up and ready to recognize the need for change. Although this point emerges clearly from a consideration of biological facts for viable systems, and although it is well illustrated by our simple machine, it is not understood by management. In the firm, error is anathema. This is not to say it is avoided, of course not, but it is treated with hostility, not as having a value of its own. A perspicacious manager would review every mistake made within his command as mutant behavior and make himself receptive to the algodonic feedback the incident invariably generates. His observed tendency is, on the contrary, normally to concentrate wholly on correcting the faults. Thus, the system's errors are wasted as progenitors of change, and change itself is rarely recognized as required. All the managerial emphasis is bestowed on error correction rather than error exploitation. In turn, errors themselves are reiterated as being essentially bad. Thus, it follows that when change is really understood for some extraneous reason to be necessary, people resist this need because to attempt change is automatically to increase the error rate for a time while the mutations are under test. So yeah, when do you know what error tolerance you want? Very good question. I guess what I would say is, like, you probably want to have algodonic feedback from every level of your system so that you can see if the stress that the system is undergoing is actually causing breakage or pushing things to a breaking point. It's kind of like when we're talking about right now, when people are talking about public health right now, and they're saying, like, okay, if we're going to actually deal with this virus, we need a certain amount of immunity built up in the population. Now, one conclusion from that idea was the herd immunity strategy. And generally speaking, that strategy has been a disaster, and people have, pulled back on that. But as we move into the next phase of this crisis, we don't have a vaccine. The vaccine's probably a ways out. And so we really do need to introduce a certain degree of exposure in a controlled manner that is going to let us survive until we do have a vaccine. And so I think that's kind of the sort of thing that's being discussed here, is like the error is definitely not desirable from a individual human standpoint, or just from a general standpoint of, empathy to other people. But if you are a public health official who's worried about social collapse, then you do need to consider introducing a certain amount of error into the population, right? Matt, go ahead, and we'll go to Mark next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it also goes into what exactly are the communications channels, and what algodonic signals actually are taking priority. Because one thing that pops up a lot in Beer's work in Chile and stuff is getting the exact KPIs right. Because right now, our system actually does kind of value profits for shareholders more than lives. The little man in the pineal gland feels, the shocks to money more than the shocks to people's lives. They're just more sensitized to that. And it's fucked up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. No, Mark, please go ahead.
Okay, as usual, I just had kind of an impressionistic point, but reading the whole part about error just made me think of what little Six Sigma training I've had, which is all about a complete elimination of defects. But I don't know. On the flip of that, then when you're working on that, you're actually when you're coming up with projects to work on to reduce defects, you're at least you're investigating the errors. So they might have a fruitful train of thought come from them. But anyways, yeah, just kind of a side point there as usual.
Well, yeah, that really reminds me of like when Pickering came to Kyoto University to talk, and one of the members of our faculty stood up to sort of offer a rejoinder to Pickering's speech. He was like, well, okay, like this performance stuff is great. These adaptive systems are awesome. But when I get in an airplane, I want it to predictably get me where I'm going and not just sort of like through trial and error learn the best way to fly. And so like that sort of Six Sigma approach, which is very contrary to what Veer is describing here, I guess probably has some applications within certain domains, but it is a big question of like when can we implement it? When is it positive to implement it? Okay, Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, it's like I don't necessarily like oppose that. I think it's just sort of different points of emphasis because, like, so for instance, as adaptive as biological systems are, there is no room for error when it comes to like how a protein is folded. Like all this adaptability comes from like certain components that really are just reliable. They're solved. And those Lego pieces then build up the layers of abstraction where all this complexity comes into. But that none of that can exist without a foundation of stuff that is there's no there's no uncertainty to it. There's basically no errors.
Right. Mark is saying Beer seems to throw in a heuristic. Let's not have a 10% error rate. Let's add an order of magnitude and have a 1% error rate.
Sorry. Last thing of I think also a part of being a viable system is understanding that you have a finite amount of attention, and so really the fewer things that you have to pay attention to. The better. So I mean, having certain things where you can always rely on these screws and these nails are just there's nothing weird about them. That's.
Yeah, that's valuable, and I think it also gets back to Beer's description of the computer, right? The algorithm implementation of a simple algorithm is just going to be. It's going to work. The computer will do what you tell it. That's something that Beer is focused on there. So there is that certain degree of reliability that we're looking for. It is just a question of how much. All right. So I think we've gone on quite a long time. This was an intense chapter because of all those 13 points there. But we'll go on to chapter 5 next week and look forward to seeing all of you then.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
That was a good
chat.
chat.
Yeah, thanks.
Nice.
Thanks,
Yeah.
guys.